While strategic management in the 80s and 90s was still characterized as emerging in the academic fields, socially and politically, there was a lot of unrest and turmoil in the United States. Along with the turmoil, there were a lot of changes in the government. Some of them were for the good, and some of them were not for the betterment of society. Bill Clinton became the first two-term Democratic president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1940s. Bill Clinton saw extremely high approval ratings, a balanced budget, national prosperity, increased numbers of minorities and women in his administration, and this had not been typical of other presidents in the past. In the early 90s were the Rodney King race riots in LA. Rodney King, an African-American man, was pulled over for existing warrants and was brutally beaten by 4 white cops. These cops were acquitted during their trial, and violence ensued in LA and all across the country. Another famous murder trial was the O.J. Simpson murder trial. Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman, Nicole Simpson being O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, and her companion were found murdered in their home. Throughout the course of the trial, many parts of America were divided primarily along racial lines, which led to tension in a lot of communities. There was a lot of physical evidence in the case. However, many members of the African American community chose to ignore the physical evidence, in contrast to many members of white communities who believed that he did in fact commit murder. Once O.J. Simpson was acquitted, there continued to be a lot of tension in communities based along racial lines because of this. The Oklahoma City bombing occurred in the early 90s, and at this time it was the deadliest terrorist attack to happen in the United States by homegrown terrorists. Hundreds of people died and thousands were injured in this attack. The 90s were also characterized by Operation Desert Storm, which was the war in the Persian Gulf, which mobilized over 6,000 troops over several years. During this time, Osama bin Laden began building support for Al-Qaeda and focused on the removal of U.S. military influence in the Middle East. This would later go on to affect all the U.S. and all of the world in the early 2000s. And unfortunately, also during this time was the Columbine High School massacre. At this point, it had been the deadliest school shooting in history, and due to the influence and wave of the internet, TV, and social media, it made it a lot easier to spread information, and this only set off a wave of school shootings that still continues until this day. So the 80s and 90s, while there were some good things that started with President Clinton, they can be characterized as a time of racial tension, political and civil unrest, Americans going to war, and a lot of division. And this ties into strategic management because while this is an emerging discipline, it was hard to get a lot of concrete empirical studies done on this topic due to everything else that was culturally and politically influencing society.